but it's at least the size of the average man. And its eyes are huge, a cruelly curved beak. It's got bifurcated claws that seem completely out of place at the end of its humanoid trunk and legs. And they described hearing a funny noise, which they said was like sort of static, like a detuned radio, and then seeing a huge feathered bird man hovering over the tower. And he thought it's probably more to do with the human mind. So some kind of like psychical experience. Up until recently, I've kind of felt it's either or. It's either it's a flesh and blood actual phenomenon that people are seeing, or it's their imagination. And actually, I think that's probably too simplistic. The turn of the century, doing these weird occult rituals to try and bring some sort of half bird, half human creature into existence on the very peninsula where the Owlman was first seen. We're seeing the same thing, and it's just our cultural interpretation of it. So there's something strange to me that all of the witnesses are from this sort of particular demographic. There's something there. There's something in our human experience that people are consistently encountering.
So this evening we have the lovely Sarah Pilkington, who is one of the current ASSAP executives, and she's going to be doing a talk this evening on Cornish Owlman. So Sarah, would you like to give us a little bit of a bio and tell us who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Sarah Pilkington. I joined the exec last year. And I'm one of the sort of the amateurs of the organisation, in that I haven't got any kind of formal qualification in anything to do with the paranormal. However, it's something that's fascinated me since I was a child, and this particular sort of story, Cryptid, is one of the things that actually I guess kind of kick-started my interest in all things paranormal and Fortean. I remember some of you of a certain age will remember a kids TV program called Tiz Was, and they used to have a section on really weird stuff, and the Owlman of Mawnan was one of the ones that I remember hearing about that, and things like Spring-Heeled Jack and Devil's Footprints, Faces of Bell Mares, all that sort of stuff. So I've had a kind of lifelong interest in it. Avid reader of the Fortean Times. I've subscribed for, well, probably about 35 years now, and continue to be really interested in it and the debates that it can generate. So I'm going to do a talk tonight on I think probably one of only a handful of cryptids that we have in the UK, which is the Cornish Owlman. So I will get started. Very, very few cryptids in the UK. I think it's quite sad. We've got a lot of things like black dogs, but I don't know that I would necessarily class them as cryptids, because they always seem to me to be more sort of visions or sort of something that's sort of more ethereal. Things like banshees as well, you could say, potentially, although they are sort of human in shape. But actual sort of cryptids, I think we've got sort of the big black cats. I mean, they're sort of across the country, but aside from that, we're very, very few. So this is one of the reasons why sort of the Cornish Owlman fascinates me in particular. So given that it is such a lovely, hot, sort of sunny day today, I think this is sort of quite a nice sort of intro to think about. Imagine you're spending your summer holidays in Cornwall, and it's lovely and sunny, and there's sort of sand and surf, pasties, fish and chips, ice cream, clotted cream teas, all the good things that are going to send you into a food coma. And so far your holiday's been great fun. Maybe the odd sort of grey, drizzly day, but apart from that, you've had this wonderful time on the beach, swimming in the sea. You've been to all the tourist hotspots and spent time on the glorious beaches. But today you decide you want to spend some time further away from the noise and crowds, and decide to explore some of the smaller villages. And the village of Mawnan Smith is one such village. It's at the end of a near mile-long narrow lane that's like sort of one of those old Cornish-style sunken lanes. So you've got the high hedgerows on either side. There's not much to see or do there. It is a very, very small village, but you decide you're going to wander around and sort of look at the lovely thatched cottages, well-tended gardens, and they're all ablaze with colour in the July heat. And it's so hot, you decide that you're going to make your way towards the old church, which sits right at the edge of the village. And it's a very old Norman church. It's sort of grey and squat, square tower, battlements, and it kind of sits at the edge of the town like it's this ancient guardian overlooking the village. So thinking that the inside of the church might provide you with some cooling respite, you start to turn the door handle when a shadow flicked across at the very edge of your vision. And you glance upwards without much interest, and you might have moved on, except that what is hovering above you is looking back at you. And you've no idea what it is, but it's at least the size of the average man, if the comparison with the church tower is anything to go by. It's got wings, it's dark and ragged, and if it wasn't for the feathers that you can just about make out, you would think that they were the wings of some sort of monstrous bat. And its eyes are huge and they glow red even in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. It's got a cruelly curved beak and it's got bifurcated claws that seem completely out of place at the end of its humanoid trunk and legs. And for an endless second, you stare at one another. Then it beats its wings and in 2 or 3 swift strokes, it's gone from view, flying off over the trees. You stand there stunned, incapable of rational thought or any kind of movement, and find that despite the warmth of the summer afternoon, you've suddenly gone very, very cold. You've just seen what's only spoken of in whispers, with the doors locked tight and the windows firmly shut, what lurks in the chiaroscuro shadows cast by the fierce Cornwall sun and the blackness of an unlit night. You've just seen the Owlman of Mawnan Smith. A lot of this presentation that I've researched comes from the work that was undertaken by Jonathan Downes, who's a folklore researcher. And I really like this quote he said, which was, "I've explored various explanations for events, and I'm not completely sure which one is true, but I know one thing for sure. I wouldn't let my children play alone in those woods." So where is Mawnan Smith? Well, this is the Norman church that I sort of just mentioned. It's right sort of near the bottom of Cornwall. I tried to find a sort of a map where you could sort of see it, but it's so tiny you actually you have to get a fairly local map to be able to highlight it. But it's just on the one side of the River Falmouth that goes into the River Fowl that goes into Falmouth. So it's a village which is pretty much surrounded by water. It's bordered on 3 sides by water. And it's suggested that Mawnan takes its name from a 6th century Saint Mornanus, who was a Breton monk who landed here in about AD 520. So it's a really, really ancient parish. And within the parish, there are 2 churches. There's the older one, the Mawnan Church in the small village of Mawnan Smith, which is the one that we're talking about. And that's around 3 miles south-southwest of Falmouth. And parish registers date back to 1553. So it is a really sort of old settlement and still a very small one. There's an extremely prominent earthwork which runs directly through the graveyard, and it predates the church that it now surrounds. So that to me suggests that this has always been a sacred or notable site, and that the builders consciously chose to construct the church within the ancient boundaries of the earthwork. You can just about sort of see the edge of the earthwork in that photo where the ground is mounded up. Parts of it have been destroyed or broken through multiple church enlargements, and those date back right to the 13th century. And the most recent update to the church was in 1920. And if you believe in such things, it's also connected to multiple tumuli, earthworks, other sacred sites through 3 ley lines, which run directly through the church. So Janet and Colin Board, who are sort of quite famous Fortean researchers, they did a lot of mapping in this area, and they found that they felt that Morland Smith was kind of like a sort of a hotspot in terms of a convergence of ley lines, which centred very much on this ancient church. And its location, the church's location, is one of its most striking features because it's literally right on the tip of the land and sort of overlooking the sea cliff, so very, very dramatic. It's well away from habitation, high above the mouth of the Helford River, and it was actually used as a navigational aid to sailors because it was so visible. And in 1842, there was actually a request to paint the church tower white to help with navigation. And the legend of the Owlman is very, very location specific. It is very much linked to this very, very sort of particular sort of parish location. It hasn't been seen outside of the boundaries of the parish. It's very much, all the sightings are very much focused around this church. So whatever happened in the 1970s right the way up to 2009, I think that there's definitely something very odd that goes on in this corner of Cornwall, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. There's also some really, really creepy woods, which I tried to find a sort of a representative picture of them. That's what Google threw up for creepy woods. But everyone talks about this sort of very weird woods that sort of border the churchyard, and how the trees are very sort of twisted and wind blasted in the way that you get in Cornwall, where they've kind of the prevailing sea wind has kind of twisted them over to one side. And the ground underfoot is very, very uneven with humps and hollows. So it's not an ideal place to go for a dog walk. And local people talk about the woods in very sort of reverential tones, sort of warning people not to go there. Maybe because they feel that there is something very creepy going on in the woods, or maybe it's because they want to perpetuate the Owlman legend because it generates sort of tourist income. Not sure. But anyway, so if we look at encounters for the Owlman, the first one, I went back and sort of had a look at what had been reported over the years. The first thing I could find was something that goes back to 1926. And this was, it was two boys that were attacked by something that was described as this huge, aggressive winged creature. I'll read what the newspaper article says, because I think it's pretty difficult to read it from the slide. So while proceeding along a road on Sunday evening between Mount Hawke and Porthowen, two lads had their attention drawn to something fluttering on top of a mine burrow. The younger boy ascended to ascertain what it was, and on finding a large bird, apparently dead, proceeded to examine it, as boys in the 1920s were wont to do, I should imagine. The boy was instantly attacked and ran to his brother, who managed to throw a coat over the bird to prevent any injuries being done. The bird, however, escaped the coat and attacked the older boy, who defended himself with a stick and eventually killed the bird, but not before he'd received a severe bite on his hand. The bird measured 6 foot 3 inches from the tip of one wing to the other and was 3 feet in length. It had a powerful beak, 6 inches long, fully webbed feet striped with green and yellow, and a duck-shaped body. Its plumage was cream-coloured, tinged with brown on the beak and also the upper wing coverts, which are the kind of the coverings that it's almost like the sort of the feathering that's on the what would be the shoulders of the bird. The tips of its wings were black. There was a severe wound under its right wing, which had no doubt caused it much pain and must have infuriated it. The creature was in very poor condition and, owing to rapid decay, was soon buried. Many villagers saw the bird, but none were able to name it. So this account is sometimes suggested as potentially being the first sighting of the Owlman, but it does notably lack some of the key features. So first of all, it isn't in that immediate environs of St Mawnan's Church. It talks about the bird having webbed feet, and as we talk about some of the more recent sightings, you'll see that that is very, very different from the creature that's been sort of described as the Cornish Owlman. It was a physical encounter resulting in an injury. So whatever it was very much a flesh and blood creature. It doesn't appear to be owl-like, and its colouring was quite notably different from how the Cornish Owlman is described. So given that no one was able to identify it, I think this was probably an escaped raptor, some sort of eagle or similar from somebody who might have had a sort of private collection of birds or birds of prey that they were flying, or unusual summer visitor. So I'm not convinced that this one actually is the Cornish Owlman. So the first real confirmed sighting, though, is from 1976. And from 1975 onwards, there'd been quite a lot of weird stuff happening in Cornwall. It was certainly a strange time in the southwest. There were things like UFO sightings, animals behaving strangely, unusually high amount of wild dog, cat and bird attacks. So there was very much this sort of sense of that there was weird stuff happening in Cornwall. And the Melling family were on holiday with their two daughters, June, who was aged 12, and Vicky, aged 9. And they'd come down, I think, from Leicestershire. And they'd arrived at a caravan site near Truro late in the evening of Good Friday. So this was over the Easter weekend. And they'd spent most of the following day, so the Easter Saturday, exploring the countryside around Falmouth. They stopped for a picnic near the woods next to Mawnan Old Church. And whilst the parents were preparing the food, June and Vicky decided they were going to explore this wonderful old graveyard with all the old earthworks and ancient tombstones. And parents describe that sort of their sort of peace and quiet as they were preparing this picnic was shattered by screams of terror as the children ran screaming towards them. And they described them as being almost incoherent with fear. Vicky and June demanded to be taken home immediately. They didn't want to give any explanation as to what had happened, what they'd seen. They just said, "We want to go home." Understandably concerned, parents packed up the picnic, drove back to Truro, and it was only when they were back in the relative safety of the campsite that the girls were prepared to describe what had terrified them. And they described hearing a funny noise, which they said was like sort of static, like a detuned radio, and then seeing a huge feathered birdman hovering over the tower of the church, 13th century church tower. They were absolutely terrified by what they'd seen, but parents persuaded them to do a drawing of what it was, and this is what's reproduced here, which, as you can see, is definitely not a large bird of prey, and appears very different from what was described from that 1926 sighting. It definitely looks like some sort of humanoid animal mashup. Some days later, the family encountered a chap called Tony Shields, who's also called Doc Shields. And he's quite key to this story because a lot of the witness reports seem to sort of go back, trace back to him in some way. He was introduced to the family as someone who knew all about the sort of the mysterious goings on in Cornwall at that time. He'd been collating newspaper reports about it. He was in the local media asking people to come forward with reports of strange things that were happening. So to that extent, it's not that strange that he ended up being sort of a fairly consistent figure in the reports of the Owlman during this period. He'd recently produced the first and only edition of a magazine called Nid, which was a magazine that was dedicated to all things Cornish and weird, and famously featured a picture of his a naked picture of his wife in it, which was sort of quite scandalous for the 1970s. And if you've got a copy of it, they sell for several £100s, so you've got an investment there. Tony wanted to ask the girls about what they'd seen, but their parents were really worried about causing them further trauma because they were still very, very scared about what they'd seen at Mawnan Smith. And instead, the parents gave Tony this sketch that had been made by June. Having heard the parents' story, Tony actually wrote to the Fortean Times on the 27th of April, 1976. He said, "A very weird thing happened over the Easter weekend. A holidaymaker from Preston told me about something his daughters had seen. a big feathered birdman hovering over the church tower of Mawnan. The girls were so scared that the family cut short their holiday and went home 3 days early. This is a really fantastic thing, and I'm sure the man wasn't just making it up. I couldn't get the kids to talk about it. In fact, he wouldn't even let me try, but he did give me a sketch of the thing drawn by one of the girls. There'd been no reports so far as I know, of anyone else seeing the Birdman. Even if it turned out to be a fancy dress hang glider, you'd think that someone else would have spotted him. But Mawnan's not the place for hang gliding. I really don't know what to think. It's as if a whole load of weirdness has been let loose in the Falmouth area since last autumn. So strange that something as sort of large and terrifying, I guess, witnessed by these girls wasn't seen by anybody else at the time. Although Mawnan Smith is a very small village, so the way that the girls describe the size of this thing, you would think that other people might have seen it, but apparently not. It was just the two girls. So the next sighting is again from 1976, and again two teenage, around the same sort of age, two girls, Sally and Barbara. And they reported seeing this large avian-style monster in the woods of St Mawnan. And they described it sort of taking off vertically and disappearing into the trees. And if you look at the sort of drawing of the feet, I think that's something I'm going to come back to later, this sort of weird sort of pincer-like shape to the feet. That is a fairly consistent description given by witnesses, as it having these kind of very strange, almost like pincers for feet. One of the girls provided some more information about this. Jonathan Downs, who's the folklore researcher that I mentioned, who's actually written a book on Cornish Owlman, went and interviewed Sally some years later in 2000. 2000, about what she'd seen. And Sally said that it was probably around sort of 9:45 when they'd seen it. So late summer evening, so it would have been kind of twilightish. They'd made tea with a little camping stove, and Sally said she seemed to remember that they were talking about school and boys, and that there was a boy at home that she was very interested in. Barbara wanted to know all about it, and as neither of them had boyfriends before at that point, it was sort of very much a kind of a gossiping session that they were having. It was still light, and Sally said that she remembered that it hadn't rained for ages, so the woods were very, very dry and crunchy. The sort of leaf fall was very dry. And if I read from her account, the noise was so abrupt in the quiet of the woods that we both jumped up together. It was a kind of hissing. I don't know, but it was loud and sudden. We both looked over into the woods, and there it was. The face wasn't really like an owl. Thinking back, it was like a frowning, sneering black thing. The eyes were burning, glaring and reddish. I don't know if it had fur or feathers, but it was grey. I remember hearing Barbara start to laugh, but it was a sort of choked, panic laugh. I knew right away that it was real. It wasn't like a monster in the films that looked rubbery or fake. It just looked like a very weird, frightening animal, as real as any animal in a zoo. It looked flesh and blood to me. There was simply no way that it could have been. It couldn't have been something that was born and grew. No way. I've no idea what it was, but my head hurts even thinking about it. It was more frightening than I could really describe. I remember the blood rushing to my head and making it pound. It just stood there for what might have been a minute. I'm not really sure how long. Barbara was laughing, but it was more like a sort of breathless, hysterical sound by now. I wanted to run, but couldn't. It was so evil, intensely so. When it moved, that nearly did it. I nearly started running. Its arms or wings or whatever went out, and it just rose up through the trees, straight up through the evergreens. It didn't it didn't flap, and it didn't make a sound. And then the feet, black hooking things. I've no idea how it had managed to stand up on them. They were like an earwig's tailpiece. It's very difficult trying to remember exactly what happened next. The wood was quiet, but it felt as if the thing could appear again at any second. I'd nearly fainted at one point. Barbara was the same. We were thinking that someone was going to come out of the woods, laughing at a trick that they'd played on us. But really, I knew that couldn't possibly have been a trick. On one level, my mind simply wasn't accepting it. And it still doesn't in some way. Shaking and crying a bit, we got packed up. That was the worst time, waiting for it to come back. I don't think I could have coped seeing it again. My mind was pounding. I don't know how it could have disappeared like it did. The woods weren't that thick, not thick enough to hide what I could only think of as a monster. I know that sounds silly, but perhaps the most apt way to describe it. It just seemed to vanish like a ghost. We moved camp to a place where the woods were thinner. I didn't sleep a wink, and neither did Barbara. Yet somehow by then we knew it had gone for good. The atmosphere was lighter somehow, and there were bird noises coming out of the trees, and the wind. The night crawled by, and eventually it started to get light. So something, again, has absolutely terrified these two girls, but Sally talks about this kind of conflict between it appearing to her to be very, very real, a sort of flesh and blood creature, but at the same time, it doesn't behave like one, particularly in the way that it sort of takes off vertically up through the trees without flapping, which is not something that any bird should be able to do. And she talks about this sort of sense of presence in the wood, this kind of sense of looming evil, I guess. Again, Tony Shields was aware of this account, and he sort of put feelers out, I guess, to see if anybody else had had any similar encounters. Nothing else further happened that year, no further sightings. And it was only in 1978, so a couple of years later, in response to an article that Tony Shields had written for the Falmouth Packet about his intentions to summon up local pixies, that he had a call from somebody who identified himself as Ken Opie, who said that a few weeks previously, so sometime in early June 1978, his daughter had seen a monster-like devil flying up through the trees near St Mawnan Church. So this sounds like the same creature again, and it occurred in the evening. Ken said that his daughter was aged 16, but was not there on her own, but he rang off without providing any further details. So Tony Shield has been accused of creating the whole sort of legend of Owlman, given that the majority of witness accounts seem to link back to him. And he is a well-known local hoaxer and dabbler in all things Fortean. But I think that is probably too simplistic an explanation for what was going on in that southwest corner back in the 1970s. So the sort of couple more key accounts. 1989, young man called Gavin and his girlfriend, again in the encounter something in the woods at St Mawnan. And these pictures are taken from drawings that Gavin did in his diary at the time. And again, look at the feet. It's a very, very consistent image of these very sort of huge pincered sort of claw-like feet. And very sort of angry looking face with almost like sort of two tufts either side of the head. These are sort of very consistent features with all of the sketches that have been drawn. And Gavin and Sally were, they were a young couple. They were sort of in their late teens, and they were on a camping trip with their family. And Gavin sort of explains that he and Sally used to go for walks in the early evenings, and they would return not long after it was sort of dark. And it would have been fairly late because it was, again, this happened in sort of the June or July. And he talks about that he believes that what they saw had been perched in a large conifer tree. And because of he could work out the size of the tree, he was able to work out roughly the size of this creature that he was looking at. And he believes that it was about 5 foot tall, and it was standing on a thick branch with wings sort of held up at the arms, which is what you can see in the drawing. He's got it with its sort of wings spread. From the legs are got, he describes them as having high ankles and these large feet with two huge toes on the visible side. And he described it as being grey with sort of brown ticking in the feathers, and the eyes definitely glowed somehow. And as the creature sort of noticed them, he said, Gavin described it as its head sort of jerking down and forward. So it sort of saw them and reacted to their presence, which again suggests that this is actually something flesh and blood that they're witnessing. And then he describes it as is lifting its wings up and then sort of jumping backwards and upwards, folding its legs up and then kind of just like shooting up into the trees and disappearing. So again, doesn't sound like typical bird flight. This had a really profound effect on Gavin and Sally, and they were both really scared by what they'd seen, and they decided they weren't going to tell anybody about what they'd seen. Gavin did catch up with Sally probably about 15 years later, and they talked about this incident, and she was still very unkeen to talk about it or to share the information with anybody. And Gavin sort of stood by that and said, no, I'm not going to talk to anybody about it. So the names are actual pseudonyms. We don't know who the real Gavin and Sally were. Jonathan Downes, when he managed to track Gavin down and interview him, assured him that he would kind of use these, ensure that the couple maintain their anonymity. But interestingly, Gavin talked about this encounter as having really changed his life, because it not only formed a sort of a springboard for him into a personal interest in paranormal creatures, but it also made him kind of consider the world differently, because it was, well, whatever it was that he saw, he couldn't explain. And that had a profound effect on him going forward. Jonathan Downes asked him, well, what do you think it was that you saw? And Gavin said that he thought it was probably some sort of ghost, because there was no way it could be a real animal because of the way it sort of behaved and disappeared. And he thought it's probably more to do with the human mind. So some kind of like psychical experience that they'd had. And he also talked about having had, subsequent to this encounter, that he'd had nasty dreams where this owl creature was very, very prominent. And that was something that had also continued to trouble him after the sightings. So one last one. It's quite a sparse legend, this. There's a few key sightings, but it's very difficult to kind of track down any of the original source material other than these drawings. So the last sighting documented was in 2009, when a 12-year-old girl described seeing this large, terrifying winged creature in the again in the location of the church. I've not been able to find this account. It's just kind of mentioned in sort of passing in Jonathan Downes' book, but I can't find any of the original sort of source information. So all we know is that it was a young girl called Chelsea seeing this large winged creature, which was a terrifying encounter, and so seems to fit into those patterns of sightings. Again, they seem to be, the witness accounts seem to link back to Tony Shields. And again, the descriptions, this idea of a large owl-like humanoid with glowing eyes and clawed feet, often seen flying or perched near the church tower. And then there's this letter, which was published. This was actually published in America. Gosh, who was it? I can't remember now. Chicago Herald, I think it was. Sorry, Western. There it is. I've got it on the slide. Western Chronicle, from an anonymous individual who had visited the area and talked about being absolutely terrified by this owl-like creature that he'd encountered in the woods. And he said that sort of the letter says that he's a student of marine biology at the Field Museum of Chicago. So as a biologist, he's kind of pretty, you would hope, would have a pretty good understanding of sort of creatures, their behaviour and what is likely to be normal behaviour for creatures. And he talks about having this unique and frightening experience in the woods near the old church at Mawnan in Cornwall. And he said, I could only describe it as a vision from hell. The time was 9:15, more or less. I was walking along a narrow track through the trees, and I was halted in my tracks. When, as about 30 metres ahead of me, I saw a monstrous birdman thing. It was the size of a man with a ghastly face, a wide mouth, glowing eyes and pointed ears. He had huge clawed wings and was covered in feathers of silver grey colour. The thing had long bird legs which terminated in large black claws. So again, if you look at the illustration he's put on there, feet, and to me the feet and the face are looking pretty identical to all the other sketches we've seen of it. It saw me and rose floating towards me. I just screamed and turned and ran for my life. The whole experience was totally irrational and dreamlike. Friends say that there's a tradition of a phantom owl in that district, and now I know why. I've seen the phantom myself. Please don't publish my real name and address. This could adversely affect my career. Now I have to rethink my worldview entirely. Yours very sincerely, Scared Eyewitness. So what have we got? So a few consistencies in the accounts from the eyewitnesses. So I tried to kind of like sort of pull this together and think about, well, what actually is it that they might have, what might they have seen? What are the consistent features? So there's consistency in terms of the physical appearance that people are describing. So human shape with these massive, expansive wings. And the human shape, human size as well, because most witnesses are sort of describing whatever it is they're seeing as sort of between 5 and 6 foot. Glowing eyes is a consistent feature, as are these pincer-like feet. And as I said, if you look, all those sketches, they've got those. They seem to me to be very sort of prominent features in the drawing. They've been really sort of darkly coloured in. Pointed ears, or sort of horns or something on the side of the head, and witnesses talking about this kind of solid flesh and blood like appearance. So not something that's ethereal or wispy or sort of corner of your eye type phenomenon. It's something that is very, very solid and real. Behaviour, witnesses talk about being alerted by sudden movement, that the bird or owl, whatever it is aware of their presence and reacts very strongly to their presence, which again suggests that it's something physical that they're seeing. Witnesses talk about it appearing aggressive and having this sort of sense of threat. Then this really weird thing about it taking off vertically without flapping its wings, which is just, that kind of defies the laws of nature. That a bird should not be able to take off like that. And when it is seen in the open, there's witnesses describe it as having this kind of gliding flight where it's not, again, not flapping its wings. And a few of the witnesses talk about this sort of weird sense of presence, and there being a sort of static hissing sound. I found this illustration. I was thinking, are there any sort of well-known demons or anything that are owl-headed, given that this was all happening in the environs of a church? And I found this, which demon Andras, who rides around on a wolf, but it doesn't really seem to be what the witnesses were seeing. So I can't see that this is something that they've kind of seen, that, I don't know, potentially religious individuals that have seen an illustration about this particular demon, and it's kind of the being in the church environs has had that effect on them, because that is literally an owl's head on a human body. The arms aren't incorporated into the wings in the way that the eyewitnesses have drawn. So witnesses talk about hearing this sort of weird static noise or sort of hissing sounds just sort of prior to sort of becoming aware of the creature being there. So possible explanations. Gavin talked about his belief that it was some kind of psychological phenomenon. So although he sort of described the creature as looking very sort of flesh and blood like, he felt that it was something that it was sort of mind's eye kind of thing. Mainly because of the fact that the creature didn't behave in a way that a real creature could have done. And again, thinking about some of the commonalities of reports, the witnesses say about this very sort of weird behaviour of it kind of taking off vertically, which there's no bird that known creature that can do that, which suggests that there is, this can't be just an ordinary animal that they're witnessing. Pareidolia, that's always a sort of a fairly go-to explanation. Did they see something that they misinterpreted? Did they was it like, I don't know, branches moving? It's very, very old woodland. There's lots of debris kind of hanging from branches. Did they misinterpret something that they were seeing? Is it about social contagion between witnesses? Because I think apart from the chap who is the anonymous writer who writes into the Western Herald, it's always been two people together that have seen it. So is this something about witnesses kind of, I don't know, encouraging each other, egging each other on? Is it an undiscovered species? We know that potentially there are, I mean, globally there must be thousands, hundreds of thousands of undiscovered species. You kind of think like UK, it's an island. Cornwall is still a fairly densely populated area. You would think that if there was an undiscovered species, particularly something as big as a human-sized bird creature, that it would have been discovered by now. Misidentification, did they see a real creature but misinterpret it because of seeing it in low light, or perhaps because they were feeling quite anxious, on edge, and that kind of fear effect that we know that can affect witness recall. If you're in a sort of a state of high anxiety, that can very much affect how we kind of create memories. So was it that they saw something real, and then because they were so scared that it kind of built up in their minds being something sort of very different from what they were actually seeing? Or is it a hoax? Is there somebody dressed as an owl hanging out on a hang glider around St Mawnan Church, St Stephen's Church in Mawnan Smith? For me, when I kind of put it all together, I felt that the Eurasian eagle owl is probably the best fit. I've done I kind of did like a little composite of this where I kind of sort of cut it off slightly to kind of show that I couldn't find one head on where its eyes were glowing, so I've only got this kind of side on one. But because it's a crepuscular hunter, which means that it hunts in low light, it's got eyes that will glow red. And these things are huge. I did a falconry course a couple of years ago, and we flew a Eurasian eagle out, and it's, I don't know, it's probably about 3 foot high, but when it's sat on your arm, it looks a lot bigger. These things are massive, and their wingspan is over 6 foot. They are big enough to take down small deer. So they are huge. And they've got these kind of little tufts that are sticking up on the side of the head, which witnesses talk about. They've got the grey and brown feathers. And I think what really is the clincher for me is that it's got those, the feet, when it sits on a branch, you can see you get those pincer-like feet. And those, to me, that's almost identical to what the eyewitnesses are describing. I don't know if this is going to work, given the technical difficulties we're having. Actually, no, I'm not even going to try it. I've got a sort of a link that I've embedded in the presentation, which hopefully Christian can sort of add this as a linked file for you to listen to. But barn owls make the most appalling noises when they are startled. They make this incredible hissing sound, which really does sound like static. I couldn't find the internet let me down. I couldn't find a sound clip of a Eurasian eagle owl hissing, but I would say it's probably pretty similar. An owl hiss is an owl hiss. And Eurasian eagle owls are definitely things that are kept by private collectors. They're kept by people that are interested in falconry. They're actually quite placid and quite easygoing for an owl. So I wouldn't say they make a good pet, but they are, it's not unusual for people to be keeping them sort of in private collections. And they live for around 20 years in the wild, which would cover the span of the sightings between sort of the first one in 1976 going right through to sort of 1995. And if it's one that somebody is keeping in a private collection and kind of flying regularly and then sort of bringing it, sort of keeping it in a collection, then potentially they can live even longer. So to me, this is probably the sort of the most likely culprit for what it is that they were seeing. However, I think that is maybe just taking things a little too literally and a little bit in a sort of a straightforward way. because that, to me, there's still something weird about what it is that people are seeing. So there was an artist called Max Ernst, who is he's a famous surrealist artist who was living down in Cornwall at the sort of in the early 1900s, and he was, as a lot of artists were at that time, he was absolutely obsessed with the occult. And he believed that he had an alter ego called Lop Lop, which was half bird, half man. And he was so obsessed with the idea of this creature, that he went as far as getting a sort of a group of his friends together and performing this like sort of bizarre occult ritual to try and raise this creature from, like, bring it into sort of physicality. I've got a couple more pictures of Lop Lop, but this one I thought was interesting. This isn't a picture of Lop Lop, but this is one of Max Ernst's paintings. And to me, that looks very much like a lot of the eyewitness drawings of the Cornish Owlman, but also looks very much like Mothman. So I did wonder whether, like, did he actually succeed in bringing this creature into being? Because it did. He died in the early 1970s, and this first sightings of sort of the classic sightings of the Owlman occurred at around the same time. There's also, to me, a really strong sense of liminality in terms of witness encounters. So liminality is where you get, it's kind of like a border between spaces or physical states. This classic example of this is like a sort of a deserted playground. So a place where you would expect it to appear one way, you come across it, and it's, so like with a playground, you expect to be full of children playing. You come across it on a foggy day and there's no children there. It suddenly takes on a very sort of different kind of feel. And to me, that there was a very strong theme of liminality with all of the witness accounts, and it's sort of a definition of it is that it's a kind of a liminal stage is like a bridge that takes you between two states. Sightings of the Cornish Owlman occurred primarily at dusk, so that's the kind of meeting of day and night. Between 9 and 10 on a summer's evening seems to be the sort of the creature's hour of choice. The age of the witnesses is liminal as well. They're at that kind of in-between stage. So if you're at like a family gathering, you're not quite sure whether you sit on the kids' table anymore, or because you're kind of all gangly, you don't fit in very well, and the chairs are too small. But you also look equally conspicuous sat with the adults, so you've no idea kind of like where you kind of fit in the world. And this kind of youthful liminal state is very much linked in folklore to trips to the other world and of meeting otherworldly beings. And this was something that came across really strongly for me, because all of the witnesses are under 20. The only exception is the potentially the student, the marine biologist, who could be a mature student, but I would say is probably going to be in their late teens, early 20s. So there's something strange to me that all of the witnesses are from this sort of particular demographic. The location is very liminal. It's on the edge of sort of land and sea. It's also on the edge of land and river. So it's the sort of where the sightings are happening. It's this kind of in between space. It's also a church where you've got the kind of living and the dead coming together. And I would also say that Owlman, the idea of the Owlman itself is kind of liminal, because it's sort of a hybrid, disrupting the boundaries between what we think of as being human and animal. And that kind of makes us question what is out there and what we've still to discover. There's also, I think, a strong sense of presence in witness accounts. They talk about sort of a strong sort of feeling of presence in the area before they actually saw the Owlman appear. So there are some sort of weird edges to the accounts. Also, as well, I think what's interesting is that it seems to be a very gendered phenomenon as well. All of the witnesses, apart from Gavin, who was with his girlfriend when he saw this creature, they were all young women as well. So is there something there about who the owl creature appears to? It seems to be very much, the demographic is sort of young women, young girls in this kind of liminal stage of adolescence. So I talked a bit about Max Ernst. That's a picture of him as Lop Lop. The man was absolutely obsessed with this idea of being half bird, half man, and all of the pictures that I found of him where he's sort of portraying himself as this Lop Lop creature, there's always like some young woman in the background in some sort of state of peril, and there's like some sort of threat. So you've got this woman, I don't know quite what she's doing up in that tree, but there she is up in the tree. There's Lop Lop running past, and then you've got these two kind of looming male figures in the background. To give him his full title, he was Lop Lop, Father Superior of the Birds. And he functioned as a sort of an animal familiar for Max Ernst. And he was very much, he sort of kind of had a fluid sort of presentation in his paintings. Max Ernst said that his art was about letting the imagination taking over, and he talked about having a fever dream when he was a child, where he saw figures in wallpaper, and he talked about birds becoming men and men becoming birds, and catastrophes become hilarious. So, as I said, Max Ernst messing around with his friends, sort of the turn of the century, doing these weird occult rituals to try and bring some sort of half bird, half human creature into existence on the very peninsula where the Owlman was first seen not long after his death. But again, the more you kind of dig into this, there is the original source material is pretty sparse, but there was a lot of weird stuff that was happening in Cornwall in the 1970s. This was just a few clippings that I found from the Falmouth Packet, which was like their sort of local newspaper. And in 1976, where there was that sort of double sighting with the two lots of schoolgirls seeing the Owlman in the church, you had things like UFO sightings. I do wonder how much this is kind of linked to what was happening in sort of film and media at the time. But people talk about witnesses were talking about seeing these really weird lights in the sky, glowing red mushrooms. There was very strange behaviour from animals. Villagers were afraid of footpaths. That was about this almost like sort of demon dog that was supposed to be haunting or sort of appearing along this footpath. And locals were saying that the district council needed to do something about it because people were afraid to use the footpath. Sorry, and I should say again, Falmouth. The reason why this is relevant is because Falmouth is right. It's the geographical location. It's only 3 miles from the Church of St Stephen's, which is where these sightings have occurred. A woman talking about being imprisoned in her own home by cats, that every time she went out, these gangs of feral cats would turn up and harass her into going back into her house. There were things like mass gatherings of starlings that sounded like something out of The Birds by Hitchcock. They were kind of gathering on rooftops and dive bombing people, but then also large numbers of birds being found dead. So again, just some very weird stuff happening in Cornwall at the same time. And again, this was really weird. I wasn't aware of this. Just goes to show what happens when you go digging for information relating to a presentation. 1978, there were some really weird attacks at Newquay Zoo. Pretty grim, unfortunately, because several animals were beheaded. They were found in enclosures. There was a wallaby. There was several geese, and what kind of at first it was sort of seen as being animal attacks, that some sort of wild animal must have got into the enclosures and killed these poor creatures. But when the resident veterinary surgeon carried out autopsies, they noticed that there was like the blood had been drained, that the cuts were very, very clean. So these animals had been decapitated. It was a very, very clean cut, and it did, which suggested that, well, it can't possibly have been an animal attack, because you would get sort of tearing rather than clean cuts. Again, I've stuck a link in there, which, Christian, if you don't mind adding as sort of links with the presentation. The Mysterious Wallaby Slasher. I found a very brief documentary, I think it's only about 15 minutes, on YouTube. But I think just the title alone, it deserves to be watched. The Mysterious Wallaby Slasher. They couldn't find any pattern to these attacks. They looked at things like moon phases. They looked at whether it was a consistent time of night, because it always seems to be that the keepers were turning up in the morning and finding these the remains of the animals in the enclosures. But they couldn't find any pattern. The only thing that was sort of that was consistent was that there were clean cuts, no blood at the scene, that organs were missing. And oh yes, there was also a thing that they did some very rudimentary tests of radiation levels. I'm not quite sure why they decided to do that, but they found that certainly in the wallaby enclosure, that the level of radiation was higher than normal, which just made me think about cattle mutilation, which you don't seem to hear of these days, but it seems to have all of those kind of classic features of something from another world kind of coming down and taking biological samples, I guess. Also, at the same time, there was some sort of key activity in other local cryptids. I have to say, Cornwall has got a fairly hefty share of the UK cryptids, because they've got the Beast of Bodmin, which is probably going to be a puma, and there have been fleeting sightings since the 1970s. I think probably now it's fairly accepted that there are black cats, big, that have escaped from private collections. There was a change in the law in the 1970s which made it illegal for people to keep big cats as pets. And I think that's probably why we've seen that kind of peak in sightings since the 1970s. We've seen more of them. And there've been fleeting sightings, livestock mutilations, and paw prints, things like that. The Morg, I don't know if I can say this right, the Morgor, which is Old Cornish sea giant, that appeared near Pendennis Point for the first time in 1975. Tony Shields, the guy who's got all the interests in anything paranormal in Cornwall, he got his wife and two of her friends out on the beach naked. He was very fond of getting his wife out in public places naked. I think that says something about him. But there was this sort of quite famous picture I'm going to say it was something like the Sun. It was one of the tabloid newspapers where you've got these three women naked on the beach raising their arms, trying to invoke the Morgor and to get it to appear, which unfortunately it didn't. But that is a photo that was taken, and it was seen as a bit of a bad omen. It's sea beasts that had got sort of negative connotations to the local fishermen. I think fishermen are probably one of the most suspicious professions around, but they felt that if the Morgor was responsible for bad weather and poor fishing. And then I think possibly my favourite cryptid, if you can call it that, I kind of think I can squeeze it in as a cryptid, is the hairy hands near Postbridge, which is they are to blame for a series of unexplained crashes. And people have described this sense of two very large, very hairy hands kind of clamping down on their hands on the steering wheel and turning the wheel sort of against their control and resulting in crashes. So a lot of really weird stuff that was happening in Cornwall at the same time. So it just made me think that, is it easy to say that this was just people seeing a Eurasian eagle owl that had escaped? Because it does seem too much of a coincidence that there's consistency in ages of witnesses, the gender of witnesses, and some of the behaviour of the creature that they witnessed. I also think it's quite interesting to do sort of a bit of a comparison with Mothman because they are fairly similar in that they are location specific. The Owlman is very linked to the St Mawnan parish, Mawnan Smith village. Mothman is also very location specific, confined to Point Pleasant in West Virginia. Mothman was around in the sort of 1966, 1967, so 10 years before the first sort of confirmed sighting of the Owlman. They've both got these glowing red eyes as a significant feature, although I would say that's probably not that surprising given that the creatures they're supposedly a hybrid of, they're both creatures that would be around at night. They both have got this kind of similar gliding flight pattern, and witnesses to Mothman and to the Owlman talk about sort of this growing sense of unease that alerts them to the cryptid's presence in a sort of, whereas up until that point they'd been sort of quite enjoyable surroundings. And then potentially subsequent presentient dreams, visions, not sure, certainly a feature in the Mothman encounters. The only thing I could find was Gavin talking about how he had these like sort of really weird dreams afterwards. But obviously, unlike the kind of, Mothman is half moth, Owlman is half owl. What's the explanation for that? Why would there be a difference, given that they're kind of similar in other ways? I think it's simply because owls feature in a lot of myths in the British Isles. There's a Welsh legend. I'm going to have to say this right, but Blodlyweth, who was turned into an owl for betraying her husband. And also in Wales, if you hear an owl hooting, it means a girl has just lost her virginity. I thought that was quite an interesting one. And barn owls in particular are commonly associated with death and darkness due to their habit of haunting graveyards. Also to do with the fact that that's their kind of preferred habitat, because they like to hunt sort of little mice and creatures that are running around in short grass. So owls are very strongly associated with myth and magic. So to me, that's probably why it would be witnesses seeing an owl rather than seeing seeing the same thing. People in America would see it as a moth. People in the UK would see it as an owl, just because our kind of cultural connections. So if you're interested in finding out more about the Owlman, he has featured in quite a bit of media. So Jonathan Downes, he's written a whole book about the Owlman, and he's collected some eyewitness accounts. Has actually gone back and spoken to some of the original witnesses. There's also a chapter in Janet and Colin Board's Alien Animals, which is one of my favourite reads from the 1980s. There's a chapter called Giant Birds and Birdmen, and he's described in there. But then he's also he seems to be making a bit of a resurgence as sort of a cryptid in horror. So there was a film 2013 called Lord of Tears. 4.9 on IMDb. I think probably if it wasn't for the fact it is a cryptid that I'm interested in, I wouldn't have watched it otherwise with that kind of rating. But I like the way that they've represented him. They've given him, there's the sort of black and white snap from the film there, where he's got the kind of the claw-like hands in this case rather than feet. There's also some kids programs, bizarrely, which again I've put the embedded links in if people want to sort of have a look at those in their leisure. And also there was a play which was set in Cornwall and looks at the sort of the Owlman. For some reason it's called Horse Piss for Blood. I don't know how on earth he came up with that title, but as I said, although he's probably not a particularly well-known cryptid, he's obviously caught the imagination of people, in that there's a fair amount of writing and media dedicated to him. So, in conclusion, he's one of, I find Owlman of St Mawnan particularly, Mawnan Smith particularly interesting because, as I said, it's one of the few cryptids that we have in the UK. And I think is interesting because things like Black Shuck, I think you've got quite a easy explanation of potentially people seeing real dogs. Also as well, I think there's something there about it being more of a kind of spiritual encounter that people have. Large black cats, I think, there's fairly consistent agreement that is actual big cats that have escaped from private collections. That leaves us with things like Nessie and what's it called? The Beast of Dean. I think there's supposed this bear creature that haunts the Forest of Dean. So he's in fairly limited company. We haven't got many cryptids in the UK, so for that reason, I think it's good to kind of champion the Owlman. Again, this thing about liminality, which I mentioned earlier, it highlights that kind of thin line between myth and reality in folklore, and this kind of debate as to, well, are people seeing something real, or is this about a psychological phenomenon, or is it just people misinterpreting because of sort of how fear can affect our memories? And it obviously continues to inspire people because as I said, there still seems to be writing about him. I think I found some short stories that people have put on the internet as well about him. So although there's limited material in terms of first-hand accounts, I think he's a really fascinating topic.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for an incredible talk. Very informative, as usual, from you. I love the fact that the last few weeks have seemed to all have some kind of multi-dimensional link feel, and that people like Mike and other speakers have brought this in, that there's potential, that there's a multi-dimension feel to things going on, where we are living maybe something like a Truman Show, where we're the entertainment value and people pop in and pop out. What's your thoughts on that?
I think this is what I found when I was doing the presentation, because I started off kind of thinking like, as I said, it's something that's fascinated me from childhood, because I think seeing those images as a kid terrified me. And then sort of looking at it with a more kind of rational kind of skeptical approach of, what evidence is there? What are the consistent facts, and what fits those facts? And I was like, no, yeah, that's an eagle owl. I'm sure it's an eagle owl. But then actually, when I looked at it, I thought, well, there's more to it than this. There is. It does feel as though, for me, I keep coming back to why those particular individuals, why particularly young girls, why particularly are they on their own that particular time of year? It does make you start to think, like, is there some wider plan? I don't know. Oh, sorry, that's my duck alarm to put the ducks to bed. And I also think as well that I'm very mindful. I can't remember who it was who said this. I think it might have been Dan Cummins, where he said that it only takes for one story to be true, and then you have to question everything else. And I do think that there's something there about, we as a sort of Fortean researcher, paranormal researcher, there's always this thing about, I've up until recently, I've kind of felt it's either or. It's either it's a flesh and blood actual phenomenon that people are seeing, or it's their imagination. And actually, I think that's probably too simplistic. I think that there is a potential for interdimensional creatures. If we look at trying to get your head around quantum physics, I mean, I started looking into that at one point. There's a really good book called How to Teach a Dog Quantum Physics, which supposedly makes it simple for everybody to understand. No. I couldn't get my head around it either, but this idea of that we can occupy two spaces simultaneously, and that kind of links into stone tape theory and all that sort of stuff.
And the twin slit experiment as well with the atoms.
Yeah. Philadelphia experiment, all that sort of stuff. I think I kind of wish I knew more about physics to kind of be able to do that sort of information justice.
It's quite funny that you mentioned that. My husband Martin has been invited to collaborate on an article that I've got coming out in Haunted magazine, and obviously he's looking from a psychotherapist point of view, and it's drawn him down the rabbit hole of quantum physics, occupying that space, and everything's an atom, even if it's a solid object like a metal, and each of those bits within that metal are small elements, so there's spaces in between that things could live. And I'm sat there thinking, this is blowing my mind that, if we're going to go down that route of having multi dimensions, they could hide in spaces between atoms, and it's just like, just when I thought that life was getting simpler when I was my age and things were easier to work out.
That's the
Quantum
thing.
physics.
It does absolutely fry your brain because it's as I said, it was I'd always thought like it's kind of either or. But I remember again things that kind of had formative effects on me. There's a story by John Wyndham who wrote Day of the Triffids called Paula's Peepholes. And it's about it starts off with people in London. They believe that they're seeing ghosts, that these people start materializing out of walls, but actually what it is tourists from the future, and they're kind of coming back to look at their ancestors. And that I thought was a really interesting idea, that actually what we're seeing is potentially people from another time, another dimension, and just for that, as with time slips, that just for that moment those paths cross. It's a fascinating topic.
I think Keith Linder touches on future time slips in his own experiences he's had. And he said that somebody that wasn't dead, he witnessed them walking across the landing of his home. And this was a very interesting concept. So, yeah, if we are in a multi-dimension, interdimensional thing, I'm hoping that we're going to start having some type of evidence that we can get. But another one, before I hand over to the questions, I was interested in hearing about the wallaby. It had very similar experiences and things that had happened as it has in Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah.
Including the high levels of radiation. And that surprised me, hearing that over in this country, in that part in the zoo, that they've also experienced it. For most people know that I live in a haunted house. We've been getting high lots of radiation that's been coming off when we're having experiences here. So Andy Guy, who invents all the equipment, is currently trying to create some kind of equipment to measure the radiation spikes that we have when we have an experience in the house. So yes, I'm loving the fact that you brought that into it, and it's feeding into paranormal experiences have all these intrinsic links that have radiation and things. Have you ever heard that anywhere else?
I was just going to say, I think because John Fraser's most recent book, One Paranormal Box of Tricks, isn't that about the idea that it's that you can get locations where there's multiple types of phenomenon that are happening. It's something. His trouble is it's like there are so many paranormal rabbit holes you can go down. But yeah, I think it's not something that we've necessarily. I've not included as in sort of standard measurements that you're taking of paranormal locations if you're trying to kind of pin down a phenomenon. Because radiation spiking and what that might do physically to you, what that might do in terms of witness experiences, how it affects your body. I don't know, but I just found, that was a report that was just kind of tucked away about this stuff that was happening in this little corner of the southwest, that I would have expected there would have been. I thought I would have heard about it previously, given that I go around looking for this sort of stuff, but it was only sort of when I sort of went into this, looking into this particular topic, that I found this report about Newquay Zoo, and it just seems to have been a very, very short-lived phenomenon. And unfortunately, there's not enough sort of source data about it. I just found it mentioned in I found the report from the vet from the zoo who looked at the carcasses, and they mentioned this high levels of radon particularly in the wallabies enclosure. And I thought, well, is that because of granite? Because you know that granite can give out radon gases, but it wouldn't be that localized.
In the experiments that we've been setting up in our house, obviously it wasn't something that we necessarily per se was looking at, because everybody has a low level of radiation that's currently, it ticks along. And if you put a Geiger counter out, obviously you can hear the clicking of it. But when we were experiencing some types of activity here, it actually stopped to a minute or 2 minutes, so that there were no underlying radiation clicks that were emitted, which was the surprise more than anything else. And then obviously it carried on, then you had a spike prior to or just after. So it's something that interests me, hearing you mention that. But I think that's I can see Christian in the background chomping at the bit, waiting to ask the questions for you. So, Sarah, again from me, thank you so much for a very interesting talk.
Absolutely love that. Thank you very much. I've been truly sat here enjoying. While you've been talking away, I've been sat here doing like research as quick as possible and reading and taking in as much data as I can. I'm really fascinated by what this story and account brings into it. I mean, that one of the first comments I actually put up in the thread here was that there is such a comparative identity of a character who has avian and human characteristics, and throughout the ancient world, from like Greece to Egypt and Native Americans, they all like to depict effectively a human figure with a Horus head, a hawk's head, or a bird's head. I mean, that is almost a symbol that is replete throughout the world. I mean, do you think they are seeing the same thing, and we are just seeing that as a more recent version of that?
I think that is a possibility, because for me, I'm always interested where you've got what appears to be a consistent phenomenon throughout time, throughout the world, because to me that says that there's something there. There's something in our human experience that people are consistently encountering. And yeah, I mean, like, what's it like? There's the legend of the Thunderbird. There's oh gosh, I mean, like going back to ancient Greek, you've got myths around God, what's it called, like Icarus and all that sort of stuff. This idea of like this sort of humanity's desire to fly, and that what differs our gods from us is that their ability to fly and to be up there, all that sort of stuff. That's why I'm rambling now, but I think that that it is a really fascinating idea. That are we seeing the same thing, and it's just our cultural interpretation of it? And that's why I touched on that very briefly, but sort of the comparisons between Mothman and the Owlman, they're very, very similar. And I think it is just probably it's the cultural context that the witnesses were coming from that potentially led to how they've experienced it. It's a bit like they say that in countries where there's a strong sort of Catholic religion, people see visions of the Virgin Mary. In other religions, people see UFOs. So we're not neutral witnesses. We have our own experiences that we bring to play when we interpret what we see in front of us.
No, that's absolutely right. So Mike Bimber Jackson says here, if we are looking at creatures as immaterial or physical, could we include things that switch between the two states? Conjured maybe, simply crossing over. Unlikely, of course, but it could be a potential third option.
I think this is something that, like, I think the more I've kind of looked into paranormal phenomena, the more you kind of have to open your mind up to possibilities, because science, as it is at the moment, isn't able to explain what people encounter, the experiences they have, the things they see. So I think probably we have to kind of be open and receptive to the idea that, maybe we need to find new ways of looking at things.
I mean, I guess my own comment really was that I dropped in the chat at this time was about how depictions of owls or figures with large eyes are quite replete. Owl-like beings that share traits with the grey alien archetype. Of course, is quite an obvious one. The kind of silent nocturnal flight, piercing gaze. Owls are often depicted as being wise, as messengers, as communicators. And those things I find quite interesting, because they are not necessarily the owl's attributes. They are something that is using that as a guise or some kind of hate to use the word cloak or some kind of appearance, and they're talking with wise words, or they're bringing communication, or they're being messengers, but they are in the guise of an owl. I find that to be quite intriguing.
I think almost glow with this idea of the wise owl, and it's like, but where has that come from? It goes, I suppose, going back to Greek myths with Athena, and she had and Minerva with Romans, that she had the owl as the attribute, and that she was seen as bringing wisdom. I don't know, but they are. I mean, they're actually quite bad-tempered creatures a lot of the time. So it just seems interesting that they're kind of seen. They have these sort of attributes. I also thought it was interesting that because they seem to have very strong associations with witchcraft as well, and they are seen as omens of death in a lot of places and bad luck. And it's like, again, why that particular bird? To me, it would make more sense that you would like, say, a carrion creature, like I don't know, like a magpie or a crow or something that is, you would see feeding on carcasses. I would see them as being a sort of more obvious candidate for that kind of rap.
So Mike Bembridge Jackson asks the question here about the witnesses' ages, that they're all quite young.
Yeah.
Do you know the age of the witness of the American publication?
No, because they didn't give any biographical details. So I'm just assuming that unless they're a mature student, they're going to be anything between 18 and 21.
Okay, fair enough. I get you.
So, yeah, and we don't actually know the gender either.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so that it does seem to be very much a phenomenon linked to adolescence, and particularly female adolescents.
Yeah, but do you think the Awan is also seen as a harbinger of death?
I couldn't find any specific reference to that, other than Gavin talking about how he had these dreams where he felt that the owl creature was in some way compelling him, that he felt it was like a malevolent influence. Witnesses were certainly absolutely terrified by what they'd seen, but I couldn't find anything about sort of stuff that had subsequently happened to them. I think this is one of the challenges of stuff that's happened pre-internet, in terms of what is left in terms of original information is pretty difficult to sort of track down. I would imagine that, though, that I would kind of, from our kind of cultural perspective, I would see that as like, it's not good news, is it? Some gigantic bird creature hanging out over you go and visit this church and there's this huge bird-like creature suddenly appears. I think all of our kind of frames of reference around that would say that was not a good thing. We're not going to go and put our money on the lottery that night.
No. So are there older Cornish folklore traditions that depict a kind of owl-like or winged creature? They could also be an earlier version.
Yeah, there's oh gosh, what's it called? Because there's the national, the symbol of Cornwall is a bird, and I can't remember what it's called. No, can't remember. I suppose it's more sort of watery, isn't it? Cornwall. The oldest legend that I could find, and there's the Mermaid of Zena, which is a really old legend. But the folklore tends to be more about sort of little people, pixies, and the kind of fisherman's lore, the sort of, don't go out to the sea if this or this is happening. So yeah, it just seems to have been this very sort of very focused phenomenon, which I think it's quite sad that he doesn't get more attention, because Mothman, you get stickers of Mothman now, don't you? You don't get the Cornish Owlman stickers.
That is a marketing opportunity.
There we go. Yes.
You need to promote Owlman. Do you think also in this age of kind of social media now, of course, is that people they can take a character like the Nightcrawler, for instance, and turn it into this marketing machine where they have plushies and figures and stickers and people have, that could be you. Yeah. I have got a Nightcrawler t-shirt, which I have to say I haven't worn since your talk at the thing the other day. It was like, I was just destroyed the Nightcrawler for me. But yeah, I find that interesting, how certain cryptids kind of fire the imagination of the public, some more than others, and why Mothman, other than the Mothman Diaries and the Mothman's Diaries, Mothman Prophecies, and the film, whether, I don't know if that's what it takes to kind of spark off the public imagination in some of these things. Chupacabra really took off in the late 90s, didn't it? Everyone had got ghost t-shirts. Chupacabra. But and I suppose, like in the UK, the only one that we celebrate is Nessie. There's a whole marketing thing there around Nessie. Maybe we need to do a better job in the UK of celebrating our cryptids. We should. I mean, the one joke I was going to put is maybe I should now. Obviously, on the ASSAP logo, of course, I've got the 5 icons that represent on our about page the 5 things that ASSAP was founded looking at, such as psi, cryptids, communication and so on. I actually might now change the Bigfoot logo to be a
Yeah, the Owlman.
Okay, that's Owlman, because that's English, that's British. I might just
Yeah.
put that over. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the one question I did want to throw up here, and I did ask it to Grok actually in the background, was what encounters were for these notable children, what influences they were seeing on television and comics, like Doctor Who, for instance, at the time, Tomorrow People, Sapphire and Steel. Was there any kind of characters at that time or enemies or that were particularly avian in their approach? In their
I don't know. I mean, Doctor Who had always got stuff like that, because I was thinking, like with the timing of the Exorcist being released, that this idea of demons being kind of like quite high in people's minds. I don't know. It'd be something to look. I think that's a really good question in terms of kind of research, because it definitely does have an influence on how people interpret experiences. And I don't think when was.
Well, according to Grok, there's an episode called The Peladon, The Curse of Peladon, 1972 Doctor Who episode that features aliens from Alpha Centauri, which are cephalopod-like avian characters. But they're the only ones in Doctor Who for the time of 63 to 89. The Tomorrow People didn't have anything. The Tales of the Unexpected didn't.
So I was thinking the only one I could think of was Battle of the Planets, but I think that was probably 80s. Because they'd all got like the bird heads. That was Gatchaman, wasn't it?
Yeah, wasn't there like Buck Rogers? Didn't he have like a hawk kind of guy?
Buck Rogers. Oh, yeah, he did. Yes,
yeah. I mean,
it's quite a consistent. Yeah, it's interesting because actually thinking about it, there are a lot of those kind of classic sci-fis of the 70s and 80s. They got like bird-like creatures in.
Yeah, Hawkman. I think it's as simple as that. Oh man, so Doc Shields. I read that he apparently was a bit of an amateur magician as well as doing all the.
Oh yeah, he was my kind of guy. He was like always doing bizarre stuff, and I think what he used to really like was annoying like the local community and the NIMBYs, and like when things got a bit quiet, he'd be like, right, I'm going to go and do some magic ritual now and raise something, and I think he would have fitted in really, really well in Glastonbury. I think he was a man of, he was maybe a few years ahead of his time in terms of like kind of whipping up the Fortean interest in Cornwall. But it's really good because he acted as this kind of focus point where if anything weird happens, they would write to him. Of course, the flip side of that is people saying, well, it was obviously all him, because it's always Doc Shields who knew what was going. He was the one who spoke to the witnesses. And it's like, well, yeah, but he was the person who was collecting these accounts. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
I suppose you can find yourself in that position, can't you? If you are perhaps a little bit eccentric and you're the one doing the research, could you then be the one, you're making it up in order to make yourself popular? So I guess he might be a victim of his own success in a way.
Yeah. But I found a picture of him in the book. I just like the fact that he was constantly. As I'm flicking through now, I keep seeing pictures of him and his wife and their mates all like naked on the beach. But you can imagine, like, sort of, yours truly, offended of Falmouth. There's a picture of him. There's a great picture of him wearing like this really bizarre hat. But it's just like, mate, you've absolutely nailed it. It's like he's gone for this particular image. Well, that's him. That's him outside. Yeah, that's as if I can get that to the camera. So that's him outside the Lich Gate at St Mawnan Church. So doing that kind of like, and here it is.
Here's one I made earlier.
Yeah.
No, he's someone perhaps we need like that today. We need a bit more of an eccentric character to take on the kind of public verbose. I guess Danny Robbins is what we got these days. Yeah,
he's like the sort of the 1970s Danny Robbins, and I like the fact that because as I said, I've been a lifelong subscriber to Fortean Times. It was kind of nice seeing him finding this thing where he'd actually written to Fortean Times at the time it happened. That kind of like, that kind of felt I was kind of reaching back in time.
Yeah. So thank you again, Sarah, on behalf of ASSAP. Before we all go, who have we got next week? We've got the wonderful Dr. Paul Rogers, who's going to be examining the Doddelson messages in cases from 1984 to 1986. Obviously, there's a limit of time. So he's just going to be looking at the messages between those couple of years. So that's Dr. Paul Rogers examining the Doddelson messages.
Now, I've got to say, if anyone who went to the ASSAP conference last year when Paul was on stage, and of course he shared the stage with the lady, of course, at the center of those messages. I mean, I've never seen a conference where everyone had their focus and you could hear a pin drop. It absolutely captivated everyone.
Yeah, the vertical plane, the book is just, yeah. And that's all sort of time slip, quantum, what's going on. Yeah, absolutely fascinating that was. That's one of the best talks I've heard. I was like jaw hanging open.
Yeah, absolutely. So it'd been really great to get to see that effectively. Obviously, it's been about a year, so it'd be great to if everyone can get in on that one. That'd be brilliant to watch. So for us this evening, hopefully it's going to be a little bit cooler where you are now. The sun is actually dipped from here, so no, it's too hot for you. Okay.
I'm off to
30 degrees. Oh, it's really, really warm. So remember, and this one's particularly for Mike Benbow Jackson, don't have nightmares.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Good night.